All right, so we are going to attempt the late night study stream. Now, normally this is known as Wake Up With Me, WUMW, and this is what I do most days before I play, just to put me into a poker mindset. Today I ended up taking a day off and not playing any poker at all, which is not common for me. Maybe take a day off once every 7 to 10 days these days because I'm playing cash a lot. It is late, but other people across the world, that's all good. So this is basically one of the ways I do it is that I'm going through the pokercoaching.com, Jonathan Little's poker coaching site that I pay a yearly membership for, and I'm going through the Tournament Master class. And at this point, we are about 40 or so sessions in, or 30 sessions in, I think, on it. And we are looking at flop strategies, and it's a very dense, it's literally over I think 200 hours of content, and it is an intense thing, and you'll see how it goes. But basically at this point, if you haven't seen this before, we're now studying flop strategies, and this one is when you get check raised. So I'm going to try to go through the whole when you get check raised section, which is 3 different parts. It starts here with as the pre-flop raiser in position when facing a check raise. So you raised, right? Let's say you're on the button, and then the big blind defends, and you're in position on the button, and then they check, you bet, and then they check raise. That's what we're talking about. And we're going to go through the other different positions in the next sections. There's a little quiz at the end if you haven't seen this before. And yeah, so let's go ahead and give it a shot, and just follow along with me. And this is also a no delay stream. So feel free to interrupt me, ask whatever questions you want. Doesn't even have to be poker related. This is the time when I try to connect with you guys and have fun while I'm doing my study. And if I didn't have the stream, I wouldn't be putting in as many hours of study as I should. So let's get started. And I'm going to have to adjust the levels because I don't know how loud it's going to be, but we'll see.
Now let's discuss as the pre-flop raiser in position when facing a check raise. So this means you raise pre-flop. The big blind calls, they check the flop, you bet the flop, and now they raise you. This is a tricky spot because you will often have been betting the flop with all or almost all of your entire range, which means your range contains all your premium made hands and all your draws, but also a whole lot of marginal made hands that are, well, marginal at this point once you get raised, and also some junk that's in pretty bad shape. When this is the case, when you're betting with a wide range on the flop, you must defend with more than just your best hands. When you continuation bet the flop with a polarized range, which is when you raise out of position calls and the flop comes good for your opponent's range out of position, like 9-7-5, there, when they check, you're going to be betting very polarized. And if you bet very polarized, then your decision to continue against a check raise is pretty easy because you're not folding your premium made hands, they're great, and you're not folding your draws that are getting the right odds plus implied odds to continue.
Polarized, meaning awesome or shit. So polarized betting, small or big. Polarized betting for hand value. If your hand doesn't have much value, you're betting. If your hand has a lot of value, you're betting. So your decisions become very easy, very ABC. I defaulted about a year ago in play at certain levels in tournaments, very much so the lower levels, $10 buy-ins and below, to a super polarized range, meaning if I hit the flop, I bet that shit. And if I didn't, I didn't. And that was that. And I found it made playing against check raises very easy. Because when I had those good hands, it was very easy to determine whether or not I wanted to continue. And there was never a lot of opportunities to check raise me when I didn't bet, obviously. So a good thing for newer players or even advanced players who haven't yet studied all these little nuances, default to a polarized betting range. Because when you're linear, you're going to have much more decisions to make. That's just a little side note that I have.
Poker is really easy when you bet with a premium range and get raised. You just continue appropriately. Same thing whenever you're out of position. When you raise out of position and someone in position calls you, you're going to be betting more polarized for the most part. And since you're betting more polarized for the most part, when you get raised, your decision to continue is usually a little bit easier because your range is just stronger in general, right? But we're going to be discussing this scenario where you're betting with all or almost all of your entire range, because that's a much more difficult spot to navigate. So, in this scenario, due to being in position, which is usually the only time you're going to be betting with a generally wide continuation betting range, your most common defense will be to call the check raise. That's because you are closing the action, getting decent pot odds, and you're in position. It is important to realize that whenever you bet the flop and get check raised, usually you are actually getting pretty good pot odds. Let's say you raise to 2 big blinds pre-flop, your opponent calls, flop comes, they check, you bet 2 big blinds, they raise to 6 big blinds. There you have to put in 4 big blinds more to win a total pot of 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 plus 6 is 16. 4 to win 16 or so means you need to realize 25% equity in position. It's kind of hard to not realize 25% equity in position with anything that's reasonable. Now, it's important to realize that when you do get check raised, your opponent will typically have 2 types of check raising ranges. Usually we're not mixing this up. Usually each player has one of these 2, but usually you will be against one of these 2 strategies. The first is a polarized strategy. This is the most common check raising strategy you're going to be against. And then some players will use a more linear strategy, which includes a lot of thin check raising with hands like top pair bad kicker because they think it's best. This is not a good strategy, but it is what some people do. And the key to navigating these spots well is to correctly put your opponent on a range of hands. So let's discuss if your opponent check raises with a polarized strategy. This is a strategy I recommend you use. It's a strategy the solver recommends you use. And it's usually just good poker. When you check raise with a polarized strategy from out of position or in position, you essentially take all of your opponent's marginal hands and make them into bluff catchers. Because your value hands that you're check raising, your premium hands, they beat most of your opponent's premium hands and marginal hands, which is very, very bad for them, right? So you're going to find that this is a good strategy to use, to check raise with a polarized range. Whenever you are check raising with a polarized range out of position, usually that's going to result in you not check raising too often, just because it's hard to have a premium hand that beats the in position continuation better's value range, right? So this actually should not occur all that often. If you go back and look through all of the examples for how to play out of position that we've discussed so far, when you are at a range advantage and often at a nut disadvantage, you're actually not check raising all that often. It's pretty rare, actually. So let's go back to thinking about the in position player who continuation betting got raised. They should not be they should not be raising all that often, because you don't want to be raising, free betting, re-raising, into the strong polarized range of the out of position check raiser. So you're going to be calling with all your premium hands and draws that are getting the right price to continue, as well as your strong marginal made hands like decent top pairs, right? And you're not going to be doing much 3-betting at all. Now, this is a little bit different than if your opponent check raises with a more linear strategy. And you're going to find that when people check raise with a linear strategy, usually they're doing that a little bit more often than if they are using a tighter polarized strategy, because it's pretty easy for most players to just look at the flop and see what top pair is, right?
So he said a lot of polarized linear back and forth, so I want to clarify, and this is clarifying for you is also clarifying for me. So what he's saying is your opponent's going to check raise with a polarized strategy. It should be tighter, a tighter check raising range, which means it's not going to happen as much. So, you're in a tournament, you're going to have the same players in the blinds quite often for a good, chunk of the time. And, you're going to be c-betting, from the cutoff, let's say, and there's these 2 guys in the blinds, or you're on the button, whatever. And, you're raising, the typical range of the cutoff and the button, nothing too crazy, but, standard for whatever blinds you're at. And then you're c-betting quite wide because, if you just got called by the big blind and the flop seems generally good for you, not exactly, something that just crushes the big blind's range, then you're going to c-bet a lot. And you're going to see a lot of them just become fold. But when you see the check raise, it's kind of easier to assume, especially at the lower levels, that it is, as Jonathan Little's point that he's getting to, which is that it is a linear range, meaning that your opponent check raising polarized means that they have a much tighter raising range, which means they're just seeing, a good situation usually or a shit situation usually. So some players will check raise a shit situation in order to try to kill the pot. Like, let's say the player defended with 10-9 or something like that, and the flop comes off, 9 jack 7, right? So they have a gut shot, they have second pair, but there is an overcard, and let's say there's a flush draw that they don't have, something like that. So when they check and you bet, they can assume that a fair portion of the time they have the best hand. But at the same time, they don't want to see the whole board, because you're going to have overcards, you're going to have gut shots, you're going to have, flush draws, you're going to have, over pairs, you're going to have all that kind of stuff. So some players will check raise in those situations to figure out if right then and there they should continue. Now, it's not a very great strategy, because you can realize your equity very easily in that situation, because it's very often a scary board for the in-position raiser, because unless they have a hand like top set or an overpair, they're kind of going to be worried about all the same things as you. But that being said, you will see players using a strictly polarized range check raising those shit situations, because it throws a wrench in the works. So like, they check, you bet, standard C bet, 1/3 pot or whatever, and then they raise this, 3 to 4 times your bet, and that kind of puts you in a pickle. Even if you're sitting there with like queens on that board of, jack 9-8 or whatever, jack 9-7, not jack 9-7, it kind of puts you in a pretzel too, because you don't know if it's like, did they have jack 9? Are they going to go ape shit? Whatever, blah, blah, blah. And it also, there's a little side move that comes up in this situation. I just want to bring this up. This happens in cash games a lot. I've been noticing lower level cash games where a player will check raise that board. Usually it's top pair and gut shot, and then check the turn. And anytime you see somebody check raising a flop and checking the turn, 99% of the time you can be damn well sure that they just want to see the river. So when the turn comes off a brick, like, some low card, unconnected, and they check, you can pile into that with almost nothing and get the fold, unless they just have a super premium draw, because they're just trying to control the size of the pot. Think about it. If you raise pre-flop and the big blind defends, right? You make it 2.5. You're both on 60 big blinds, right? You make it 2.5 on the button. Big blind calls. That's your 2.5, his 2.5. The blinds and antes, which makes 6 blinds in the pot, right? He checks to you on this jack 9-7 flop with 2 hearts, let's say. He checks to you. You go ahead and bet whatever, doesn't matter. Ace king with the ace of hearts, and you're going to bet a standard c-bet size of 1/3 pot. Right, so that's about 2 blinds, maybe 2 1/4. Then he check raises you to 7 blinds. Okay, so obviously this isn't a situation where you're going to give it up right away. You call the 7 blinds. Now there's 20 in the pot, and you have 50 behind. He checks the turn. If you just bet 15 blinds right there, that pot's going to go down a huge percentage of the time. Because because what he's expecting to happen is he check raised, then he checks the turn when like a deuce of clubs comes off, and he's expecting you as the pre-flop raiser to just say, well, you know what, I don't think I have the best hand. Maybe I can catch an ace or a king on the river, or something like that. Maybe I can catch up. But the problem is you're allowing him to control the pot when originally this was your lead. You allowed him to take it away, and now he's trying to control the size of the pot. It becomes a situation of check, bet, check, raise, check, check. When it should be check, bet, check, raise, call, check, bet, bet. It should be you betting the turn, or betting the turn and betting the river, if you don't see anything really scary comes off that completes a draw. I have rarely seen a player call that turn bet. Just all side notes, things that my brain needs to reinforce that I'm going to tell you guys. So, or they're going to have a very linear raise, or very, very polarized system or strategy on that flop of jack 9-7, where they flop 9s and 7s. This is the most common one. They flop some 2 pair even Jack 9, top 2 pair, you c-bet, and then they check raise, and then you call, and then they bet the turn and go from there. It's usually because they have a good hand and they're just trying to get the money in. So you defend against this by calling with the premium hands, right? Like the real premium hands, like top sets, big overpairs, that don't have much chance to get outdrawn, and all the draws that are getting the correct price. Now that means open-enders and flush draws if you're seeing a standard check raise size, blah, blah, blah. Because now, even if they're check raising you a 2 pair, if you are getting 3-1 on a call and you have the open-ender or you have the flush draw and a gut shot, you've got the odds. So you just go ahead and continue and call. Now we're talking about if your opponent has a more check raise, which is a more linear strategy, it's going to be typically wider check raising range, meaning they're going to be doing it with a lot more top pairs, weak kickers. They're going to be doing it with a lot more draws. They're going to be doing a lot more stuff like that. In those situations, calling with your premium hands that don't need protection, like pocket aces needs protection. It's 1 pair on that Jack 9-7 board, right? And some draws. Because you're basically looking at a situation where you have to draw out. So draws that are getting the correct odds, right, versus a polarized strategy, that's great. But at the same time, if you don't hit them in this scenario with somebody with a polarized betting strategy, you can actually bluff them off later. Like I was saying, the check raise check, you can then bluff. So that's why calling on the flop and then the guy checks and it's just like, oh, wait a minute, he's trying to control the pot, and then you just pile a bunch of money in on the turn. You're going to see players go, well, that didn't fucking work. I've now exceeded the price that I was willing to invest in this hand before improving. So that you just take it down. So premium hands that don't need any protection, you're calling with. Top set, straights, top 2 pairs and better. Things like that. Don't need much protection just because if somebody outdraws you when they only have, 30% to do so, that's going to happen. But if you're not a fucking mongoloid, you're going to figure out that happened and you're going to give up the hand. So, but you don't want to scare off something where somebody's check raising top pair and you have middle set, like why pile the money in? Like let them continue betting, because then that player is going to continue on the turn and bet. And if they don't, then you can do some tricky stuff. You can do smaller bets and try to induce the check raise on the turn. I've done it where that's happened, had the set, the guy check raised me, and I knew he was a super tight player. We were super deep, and I was like, you know what? He's either got aces or he's got like top pair, great kicker. I'm just going to call, and I said this on stream. I'm remembering this hand. I said, I'm just going to play it like jokers. And I called, and the turn came off some rag low card, and he checked the turn, and I took a long time, and there was about 15, I think, blinds in the pot or so, and I just bet 3. This very small bet. And what I did was I allowed him another move. So what he then did was he made it 30. And I looked at that and I started laughing and I said, this couldn't go any better. I thought for a super long time and then piled the money in for like another 80 blinds. And he fucking snap called me with top pair, top kicker with no way to win. And it was just one of those ones where if I had checked the turn, or even if I had bet normally like 10 or 12 blinds, he would have just folded it. But because I opened up the door for this weird scenario, it allowed for this, major thing. So those are the ones you're going to call with that don't need protection. You know what I'm saying? This is, we were talking about on the turn after that. And some draws, like monster draws. You should 3-bet the flop with your premium hands that need protection. So, like, let's say you made that raise and you have, you have top, you have ace jack, right? And you're on that board. Well, that now needs protection. So you're going to be, when you bet and he checks and you bet and he raises, you're going to re-raise. You know what I'm saying? Because you're like, fuck that. You're not getting any free cards off. You want to get it in, the money's in. Plus some draws that are good enough to stack off. Open-ended, straight draws with a flush draw, things like that. Standard stuff. High equity. The higher the equity, the more you're going to be 3-betting that check raise on the flop.
If they have top pair, they're raising. Fine, easy game. But if they're check raising with a more polarized strategy, they have to be able to correctly identify the draws they want to be raising. And quite often, whenever you are continuation betting very, very wide, it implies the board is kind of lacking draws, right? So if the board's lacking draws and your opponent's still raising, either they're looking hard to find bluffs, usually with gut shot straight draws, backdoor flush draws, etc., or they're just check raising with a strong check raising range, which is why, again, when your opponent's polarized, you don't want to do a whole lot of raising. But if your opponent's check raising with just any top pair and better, now you should call with your premium hands that don't need protection. These are like 2 pairs, sets, etc., plus some draws that are getting the right odds to continue. Usually these are going to be the more marginal draws that don't want to get in immediately. And you should be 3-betting the flop, re-raising the flop, with your premium hands that need protection. This is going to be stuff like strong top pairs, over pairs, etc., plus some draws that are confident enough to stack off, like, you know, strong draws plus, like flush draws plus straight draws, etc. Okay? Now let's discuss as the stack to pot ratio gets shallower. You're going to find that shallow stack to pot ratios are pretty common when you do get check raised, even when you're playing 40 big blinds deep. As your stack gets shallower and shallower in relation to the pot, it's going to result in your opponent needing to play a more linear check raising range because they know you are going to call off more often due to you getting pretty great pot odds, right? So we essentially go back to this scenario. This scenario becomes more correct for your opponent as stacks get shallower and shallower. So as the stack to pot ratio gets shorter and shorter, you, the in position player, should be more willing to 3-bet the flop and just get it all in immediately. And especially as your stack to pot ratio gets to less than 1, meaning you have one stack size remaining in your, one pot size remaining in your stack, there, if you're going to continue, you really just shouldn't call much of anything and you should just blast your money in. And that's because if your opponent ever folds anything, even a junky draw, protecting against that hand is often worth it if your opponent doesn't have a whole lot of money left. And if they want to call it off with a bad draw, they're welcome to do that too. And the same logic applies before, where you should be 3-betting your flop, or 3-betting the flop with your premium hands that need protection and draws, and calling with the premium hands that don't need protection, that also are, you know, still going to be stacking off on the later betting rounds. And we'll discuss that as we go through a few examples. So this is a neat spot. This is the one scenario that's actually pretty difficult to navigate because you continuation bet the flop pretty wide. But like I said earlier, if you are betting with a polarized range, as you often will be when you're out of position or when you're betting when the board is not great for your range, it's actually not all that difficult to defend against raises. Just continue with your best hands and draws that are getting the right price. And fortunately, that'll be the majority of your range, which will result in you defending decently often. But this spot is a little bit tougher because you have to continue with more than just your absolute best hands.
Because you're going to be seeing the check raise far more often. So now, if you guys haven't seen this before, hey, what's going on, Gray Fox? How you doing, my man? Good to see you, bro. We're doing a late night study session. I don't know if you've ever seen these, but I do these in the morning. It's morning there. How am I? I'm great, man. It's 1:30 in the morning here. But I'm guessing you're thinking a more normal time of morning. This is actually my nighttime. But we're doing a wake up with me at night. So I've been up all day, but I haven't been playing any poker. I've been working on some edits. I ran some errands, had some good fun today. Took a nice day off and decided, you know what? Courtney's working with a client. She's still doing the nails. It's late night. I got nothing to do. I didn't feel like editing anymore, so we're going to do a wake up with me at night. So we're going through the check raise section of flop strategy on Jonathan Little's poker coaching site, pokercoaching.com. And it's a lot of fun, and we just got really in-depth with this. So if you guys haven't seen this before, we go through this section. He talks out the concepts. I talk them out with you. And then afterwards, we have a test at the end of every one of them. So we're going to have a little quiz to see if I got the concepts down. Now, I will confess, because of my dyslexia, I tend to get these wrong and then realize, wait a minute, I flipped the words around. So I'm going to go very slowly. As the pre-flop raiser in position, your most common defense when facing a check raise will be to 3-bet. Very false. Yeah, because your most common defense is to call because, as we said, you're not wanting to blast somebody off a hand that you crush if they're linear, and you don't want to pile it into them if they're more polarized, meaning they're just crushing you. The opponent will typically have 2 types of check raising ranges, a polarized range and a linear range. If he uses a polarized range, you should call more with your premium hands and draws that have the correct odds. That is 100% true. Thank you very much. Proper way to defend against polarized ranges. Okay. You should 3-bet the flop with all of your premium made hands that need protection when you're facing a linear check-raising range. I mean, that makes sense to me. Yeah. I mean, if your hand is an overpair versus somebody with a linear range, meaning they have high equity, maybe they have top pair and a flush draw or something like that, you're going to want to pile the money in. We're talking about all these examples that he gives, by the way. The standard is we're at 40 big blinds because that's where you live in tournaments most of the time. So when he's talking about these sections, he's talking about 40 big blind poker. And we went through the pre-flop stages, and we're going to go through different stack sizes on the different streets as time goes on through this. But when we're talking about what should you do, and that's the question, 40 big blinds, that's what we're talking about. Which is true regarding stack to pot ratio, select all that apply. As the stack to pot ratio decreases, you should be 3-betting, getting it in more often. Well, that's very true. You got 40 blinds and you bet and somebody check raises and you have top pair or an overpair, you should probably just get it in. The lower the stack to pot ratio, the more linear the check raising range is. When you're up against a polarized range, the more calling you do and less 3-betting. Okay, this is what? When you're up against a polarized range, the more calling you do and less the 3-betting. That's not true. The lower the stack to pot ratio, the more linear your check raising range should be. Yeah, I'll go with that. Wrong. All of these are true. Okay, wait a minute. When you're up against a polarized range, you do more calling. The more calling you do and less 3-betting. So if I'm up against a polarized range, I'm calling more and not 3-betting because the person is best playing on equity, not versus their hand. Okay, that makes sense. All right. I'm going to mark this section as complete. There's 2 more sections in the check raising section. We're going to go on to the next one right now. Good to see you guys out here. Hope this isn't too boring for you. There is no delay, so feel free to ask me all the questions you want.
Now let's discuss.
Okay. As the pre-flop raiser in position when facing a check raise, we're going to have some examples.
As the pre-flop raiser in position when facing a flop check raise, we'll go through some examples here. You raise under the gun +1, big blind calls, flop comes ace, jack, 5. This is the very, very common spot where you are going to be continuation betting frequently using a...
So interesting to note, we're in position, but it's a different example than the last section. Because we're in position under the gun, meaning our range is super strong under the gun and the big blind is just defended. But we do have position on them, right?
A small size, right? So big blind checks, you bet a third pot, they raise to 50% pot. First, let's discuss how to play against a reasonably strong, fundamentally sound player. Then we'll discuss how to play against someone who is check raising with a more linear strategy. So against a good, strong, fundamentally sound player, just first go through and categorize your hands. Premium hands are going to be something like decently strong aces and better. As you see, I've selected ace 10 and better, plus sets, 2 pairs, etc. Marginal made hands are going to be the weaker aces. I have kings and queens selected with a spade. That's what these notate here. The other kings and queens I'm going to fold. I have king jack selected. Then also queen jack suited, jack 10 suited, jack 9 suited as the marginal made hands. You may ask why I want to continue with king jack instead of pocket kings if they both lack spades. That's because if king jack is behind an ace, it has 5 outs to improve. Whereas if kings is behind an ace, it has 2 outs to improve, right? And the odds that the opponent's check raising with like pocket queens here, you know, the hand that's in between kings and king jack, is like basically impossible. It's basically impossible for that to happen. Draws, I have the flush draws, the spade draws. Then I also have king, queen of spades and hearts, and king, queen here with a spade for backdoor flush draw. And then the junk here are all the backdoor flush draws we bet that don't have a gut shot. So like, see, we have king 10 of hearts, queen 10 of hearts, but queen 10 of diamonds and spades are folded. Also, I think we had king 8 of hearts in a draw category, but I moved it to junk. Also, 10s to 6s I moved to junk as well. So I think that's what we're doing. Seems reasonable to me, and you'll find that we're still actually getting to defend a decent amount of the time here. 67% of the time, which is pretty often, right? And that's because when you're betting with your entire range, very often it implies that you don't have a ton of draws and junk to begin with, right? Which is why you get to bet with your entire range. Now, one thing you will notice here is that a lot of the marginal hands that I'm sticking around with lose to the best hands in the opponent's polarized range. But that is okay because the opponent also has a lot of junky draws in their range. If you think back to the Gto solution, the Gto solution had the opponent check raising their best hands, of course, but also some bad fives. Remember the bottom pairs were check raising? So if the opponent's check raising stuff like 5-2 here, then obviously you don't want to fold an ace, right? You're just in great shape. So you have to stick around a decent amount against a Gto opponent. Now, what if your opponent's only check raising perhaps ace 10 and better? Well, if that's the case, now we should actually fold out a ton. We should fold out all of these low ace X that don't have backdoor flush draw. Maybe in a backdoor flush draw it could be fine to fold. We want to fold out king jack that doesn't have a flush draw, right? We still stick around queen jack of spades, jack 10 spades, jack 9 of spades. Pocket kings and queens just becomes a fold, right? And you would also continue with your front door flush draws. Probably don't need to continue with the backdoor flush draws. So it's just way easier to continue against someone who's only check raising the best hands because your defense strategy is just very easy and logical, right? So against someone who's polarized, I would use this strategy. Against someone who is linear, say ace 10 or better, I'd continue with just like my good aces and better, really more like ace 10 and better, maybe even tighter than ace 10 and better. Maybe like ace queen and better even, which I know sounds really nitty, and it sounds like we're overfolding substantially. But if the opponent is check raising with only good hands, you should overfold, right? You should fold more often when your opponent's range is just generally stronger across the board. But when your opponent is polarized with the appropriate amount of bluffs, which again is kind of hard for a lot of people to have on ace jack 5, you in turn should stick around way more often. Let's take a look at the Gto solution here. As you see, all of these cells have been filled up to normalize the percentages we have them, although we do have them pretty frequently here because we were betting pretty often. So notice here, the solver is doing something I didn't recommend in my image. I had no raises, but the solver is raising all in with a few hands, mainly ace king, right? And you may ask, why is it raising all in with ace king? Because if you think back to our notes from before, let me go back over here and show you. In this scenario, you should, against a bit more of a linear strategy, which, maybe we're against this scenario, who knows, call your premium hands that don't need protection and draws, and 3-bet, re-raise, your premium hands that need protection and some draws. So, which premium hands don't need protection against the various draws on this board? Well, obviously all the draws need protection against flush draws, but you don't know your opponent has exactly a flush draw. So here we are calling ace jack a decent chunk of the time, pocket jacks, and pocket fives, right? But we're jamming ace king, some ace queen, and even some lower suited aces, which is kind of interesting. Also, jack 10 suited looks like it likes to bluff, which is cool. Notice this range is just straight linear for the most part. And you'll find that often is what the solver likes doing in this spot, is just taking the hands that are almost certainly best, that don't mind protection, and it just rips them in. And I think that's a fine strategy. Again, it's a little bit tough to implement, but I think it's fine. Notice the solver folds 35%. I was folding 34%, so that lines up. It looks nice. Looks like solver calls king queen a little bit more than I do, and king 10 and queen 10 it calls every time with king 10 and queen 10. I think that's a little bit loose. Here it's sticking around with the flush draws that it has. So everything else looks pretty much right? So good. Kind of interesting to see the solver sticking around with stuff like all king 10s though. Notice here again, even though king 10 fills the whole cell, the solver does not have all king 10s because it doesn't even play all king 10s to begin with. All right, let's take a look at this spot. You raise under the gun +1, big blind calls, flop comes jack 6-6. This is a spot where you should not continuation bet every time. I went through and I removed all the hands that check back the flop. That's going to be aces, ace, king, ace, queen, ace, 10, jacks, 10s, 9s, 8s, 7s, 6s, etc. And then I have us betting the flop small with this range. And again, this is a spot where the solver is going to be very mixed in all of its frequencies because you're not continuation betting the spot 100% of the time. In this scenario, big blind check raises us, so that's where we are. Now, I think we need to fold more often because we lack the nut advantage. When you lack the nut advantage, you should be folding out more often. Okay? That's just what you have to do. When you lack the nut advantage, you have to fold a decent amount more. You may say, isn't like ace jack and king jack and kings and queens, aren't these premium hands here? Kind of. The thing is when you get check raised on jack 6-6 against the big blind, their range actually includes a whole lot of sixes. So now, these hands essentially become bluff catchers. This is a spot I was referring to earlier where when your opponent's check raising here, you don't want to just blast it in.
My definition for bluff catcher is typically, what am I happy getting with half my stack in, right by the river in this scenario with 40 big blinds, and what am I terrified to get my whole stack in with? If I have kings here and I get check raised from under the gun versus the big blind with, on a jack 6-6 board, I'm probably going to be okay if he bets the turn and checks the river, which will usually result in somewhere around a third, maybe half of my stack getting in, even if he bets the river. I'm usually okay with that because there's a lot of jacks in that betting strategy. There's a lot of queens. There's a lot of, backdoor stuff. There's a lot of bluffs when, a certain suit comes off. They maybe have the ace of, things like that. But I'm really not happy if the check raise happens and there's a big bet on the turn and now I've got half my stack in, let's say, and then the river comes off and there's no ace, there's nothing to slow them down, if they have a jack, and they just jam all the chips in. And that's a scenario where I'm really not happy getting it in. But you'll see in this scenario a lot, you'll see a check raise on the flop, you'll call it, then they'll check the turn, and of course you check it back, and the river comes off, and you'll see them bet for value. And that'll be the ones that'll be a jack, and you call, and you're going to win those ones about 70% of the time, because very few people play a 6 that way. A very tricky player will play the 6 that way, thinking, oh, well, maybe I can, get him to the point to believe that I'm, that I'm just full of shit, and but I have a 6. But anyway, that's my definition of bluff catcher. Something that's happy winning a medium pot, but not really excited to get all the money in.
In with these hands. So this is a spot where the solver will have basically no re-raising strategy because we have almost no nuts in our range. And the nuts we have, ace-6 and pocket 6s, is just has our opponent drawing then to dead, right? So you don't need to re-raise in those scenarios. In this scenario, you may think this is a little bit optimistic, but I have us calling the check raise with all of the backdoor flush draws that have a decent wrap around the jack, right? To have a backdoor straight draw as well. You'll find, though, that the lower ace highs do not continue. You may say, why do the lower ace highs not continue, but the king high and queen high do continue? That's because when you do get check raised on this board, usually your opponent's going to be either wrapping around the jack or the 6 with their check raise bluffs. They're going to have 8-7 suited. Turns out, all of our draws beat 8-7 suited, right? And you'd rather have just additional bits of backdoor equity because you're probably going to end up folding these backdoor draws by the river when you miss and fail to improve anyway. And you're not just calling a flop bet, calling a turn bet, and calling a river bet with ace high, right? So you want to have the most amount of backdoor potential in these scenarios when you do stick around against a flop check raise. And by the way, these hands in green, we're not folding them. I want to make that clear. We're not folding these hands by the river. But we also don't want to just blast our stack in immediately because that forces the opponent to fold out 8-7 of hearts, which is almost dead. And it forces, them to always call the 6s, which beat us. So this looks pretty nice to me. I have no problem with this. By the way, whenever we're calling in this scenario, you don't need to be too worried about the balance of these hands. Also, the categorization is not all that important. You just need to have some idea of which hands you plan to call down with. And right here, even though I have these hands in green called marginal made hands, they're basically premium hands, right? That we know are not folding. So don't get too stuck on the categorization. Let's take a look at what the solver does. Notice solver raises none. Calls about, 60% total, folds 40. Oh, line up nicely on this one. So I fold 40. Take a look at what the solver does. Solver calls with some ace-high backdoor draws. Notice it also sticks around with the ones that wrap around the 10s, like CC 10-9 suited.
There's also things like, the king-queen sticking around, or the king-10 sticking around, the wraparounds of the jack. because your opponent's going to check raise with a lot of queen tens and queen nines, 8-7s, with backdoor straight flush draws or backdoor flush draws, things like that. And then they're going to end up checking the turn or betting the turn and then checking the river. And there's a lot of cards that, like when the 10 comes off and your opponent is sitting there with, the queen 9 or the 8-7, they're going to continue betting because that should be a bad card for your range. But in fact, it's actually helped your range because now you've picked up a gut shot with king, queen. 2 overs are still good versus a jack. But, just a little thought of why there are junk hands that become marginal made king high versus the just lone ace high.
When it has it calls, king queen suited, right? That calls again with backdoor draws. If the solver has ace king, it does have to stick around. Ace queen sticks around a decent chunk of the time too. I believe I just checked all those on the flop, so I didn't have those. But this sounds nice again, right? And as you see, you can't just fold immediately when you get check raised. Now, let's go back and think about what if we knew our opponent, when they check raise, had mostly good jacks and sixes, if they're check raising linear, right? Now we should continue with probably ace, jack, and better and fold everything else. And again, that's going to result in us overfolding to the flop check raise, but that is okay. It is fine to fold to the flop check raise if you know your opponent's range is just a decently strong linear range. Whenever I say, by the way, the opponent's range is like a decent jack or better, let's say we know they're check raising like jack 10 and better here, planning on getting it in, right? They're just not folding. In that case, you don't want to necessarily continue with your weakest jacks, like king jack, because you lose to all your opponent's sixes still, right? So you can't continue with all of your top pairs when your opponent's check raising even slightly weaker top pairs. So sometimes this is going to result in your opponent check raising jack 10. You fold out the king jack because you know their range is jack 10 and better. And they're like, haha, I had the nuts. And they show you the jack 10, like, I had it. And you're going to be like, oh my God, I folded out king jack. But realize you also have ace jack, kings, queens, ace 6, and sixes there to protect your range. So sometimes you're going to end up folding out the best hand against a linear player when they do check raise you, but that's okay because they're going to be running into your nut hands whenever you don't fold, and they're just going to stack off for all their money every time that they do have that top pair marginal kicker.
Makes pretty good sense. Having a strong range advantage, but then a shit flop coming down, it makes it kind of easier because you do end up in situations where you can defend flops and fold turns or rivers when you see another bet. When you get check raised on ace 5 jack under the gun +1 big blind, should you ever 3-bet the flop? Yeah. I mean, if you have the ace king, right, you're going to be jamming that, right? Still, yeah, because that one's one that needs protection, so you don't mind piling the money in. Like ace queen, it says right here. Okay, yeah. When you get check raised on this board, jack 6-6, when you have under the gun +1 big blind, should you ever 3-bet the flop? No, not really, because even the hands that are strongest to get all the money in, ace 6 and sixes, what the fuck? You're going to scare the guy off. So no. Yeah, nut disadvantage. So unless you have the actual nut, then you probably should just, call and see what happens. Mark that as complete. There's one more section to this check raising section. If you guys have any questions or you want me to go back, you want me to put something in equilab, let me know. So let's mark this as complete.
Let's take a look at a few solver images for when you're the preflop raiser in position facing a check raise with various stack to pot ratio concerns.
I always like to put myself in a headspace of what we're looking at. So as the preflop raiser in position facing a check raise, stack to pot ratio adjustments. So as the stack to pot ratio gets smaller, we're going to have adjustments. Sarah, I'm getting a text.
Just want to show you how your strategy changes as you're facing a bigger raise or as the flop raises a little bit bigger. So let's take a look at this. Button raises, big blind calls, flop comes 9-7-5, big blind checks, button bets small, although you know they're still betting with a pretty polarized range. Big blind raises. Here's what the button does. Notice big blind raises all in, 7% of the time, calls a ton still, right? And folds 32%.
This top pair, top kicker being the largest slices of the check raise. I think the only thing bigger is the Jack 8 suited and pocket jacks because of the protection that they need. But kings and queens significantly less. I find that interesting.
You may say, how does the button get to call a lot? Well, remember, they're betting polarized to begin with. So you see they are then stacking off with hands like kings, ace 9, jacks, queens, 9-8. Remember that pair and gut shot, right? And then a few bluffs. You see 9-8. I'm sorry, 9-8. Jack 8 for the double gut shot. It's essentially like one of the best draws. That's about it. Plus various other nines, right? What happens if we bet bigger on the flop, though? Now we bet 67% on the flop.
So we're reducing the stack to pot ratio. Basically, we're trying to get to the situation where we're looking to get the money in. So I'm not looking at the solver. So on this flop, when are we c-betting bigger? Well, we're c-betting bigger when we're very polarized. So we either have our crap section, or section that didn't miss, or that didn't make anything, like the ace kings, the the good hands that started out good but it flopped garbage, and overpairs, aces, kings, queens, jacks, tens, I guess, yeah. Pocket eights, there's some case for it. There's definitely a case for ace 9 top pair, but we're talking about being on the button, so we're gonna have all that stuff. I like 9-8 a lot for it. I like 9-6, especially suited for the backdoor in a lot of this. I like a lot of that. Yeah. So those are the ones where you would bet bigger on the flop. So it becomes a very easy strategy where if you bet bigger and you have one of those crap ones like ace king or ace queen, you're just gonna fucking fold. And when the player raises you, you're just gonna pile the money in.
Instead of betting 33, where we did 7% all in, 32% fold, now we're going to fold way more often because the opponent's raising to a bigger amount. We're calling less often because we have more of our stack at risk. And now we are jamming it all in substantially more often. Okay? So now you see we're just jamming all the overpairs, jamming Jack 10 for the draw, Jack 8 for the draw. As we're jamming more premium hands, we get to jam more draws, of course. Jamming 9-8, 9-7. Also note again, calling 7s, 5s. Of course, in the previous example, we call with 7s and 5s because they don't need protection. But this is what we're doing as we get essentially shallower stacked in relation to the pot. So that this is something you definitely want to be aware of. As you get closer and closer to all in, you just want to get it all in with your best hands and your best draws. Let's take a look at another scenario. Again, these have been normalized to show the full cell, so it's not just like tiny slivers of hands. Here, button raises, big blind calls, big blind checks, button bets 67% on the flop, big blind raises. All right. Now you see 11% all in, lots of calls, some folds, that's fine. But let's take a look at the difference here. Now we have 25 big blinds deep. Okay, so you see here, in this scenario, 40 big blinds deep, because we're a little bit deeper stacked, we do a lot of calling, right? 46% calling, 42% folding. Now, when we're shallower, same exact hand, we're just 25 big blinds deep instead of 40, we have to be a little bit more inclined to get it all in. Again, I want to make this very clear. You're pretty much never jamming with your absolute best hands. Like take a look at Jack 6, pocket jacks, pocket 6s, pocket 2s, the sets. These hands bet the flop as premium made hands, but when you get raised, you don't need to re-raise and just blast your money in. It's a big mistake a lot of people make. They think, all right, premium hand, I'm all in. But no, when you get check raised, these hands essentially become nuts that help protect your decently wide calling strategy. Like take a look here, right? King 10 suited, calls. King 9 suited, sometimes calls. King Queen offsuit either calls or bluffs, right? Ace King is ripping it in, essentially as a kind of bluff on this board, right? Notice even like Ace 6 is getting it in when you're shallow stacked. When you're shallow stacked, you should be getting it in decently wide. Your calling range is going to contain a lot of middle pair type hands, a lot of top pair bad kickers, a lot of bottom pairs.
These are my blind spots right here. The 25 big blind bets, and then versus the big blind, and then c-betting the 6, and then like let's say you have the ace-6 of diamonds, and you're on this flop and you get check raised in this scenario. Jamming the money in is a true blind spot for me, but I don't see it as a faulty move. It's just one of those ones I have to pull the trigger on. It's one of those ones where we're just kind of saying, look, if you got it, you got it. That's fine. So we're just basically banking on the fact that the jack is only going to come out, a third of the time when our opponent has a jack. What jacks are they just calling with? They'd have to have shit jacks, and those jacks are going to find it very hard to call off, even though they check raised, because you're going to be betting small. C-betting like 2 big blinds, they're going to go to 6, and you're going to jam for, now you're going to have like 20 blinds left after the raise pre-flop, and the C-bet. So it's going to be hard for them to call off that last 14 blinds, even with a hand as strong as like Jack 10. Obviously, Queen Jack and King Jack are easier, but I think King Jack 3-bets a ton in that scenario. Queen Jack, I think, is the only one you really run into. So it's just good to recognize that this blind spot isn't founded through anything really based in reality for me. Just that it's a blind spot that I have. I like the ace-king suited in this scenario because, again, we're c-betting like 2 big blinds. We get raised to like 5 or 6, and we're jamming. We're putting our opponent to a test for, 15 to 16 blinds when we have 2 overs for outs. So when they have hands like Queen Jack, that one that calls us there, we do have outs against it. You know what I'm saying?
And then various overcards that have some equity. But again, shallow stack, you're mostly getting it all in with your decently strong hands that don't mind protection. But as we're deeper, we're going to do a lot more calling with those hands. Okay? Remember, whenever you are jamming, by the way, always make sure you have some draws in your range. And like right here, you see King, Queen. These are the draws that are opting to be raised. Notice Jack 10 is mostly the hand that's jamming. I will say when you're 40 big blinds deep, I don't actually hate the idea of just not having a re-raising range in scenarios like this because you see it's kind of a small portion of your range to begin with. But if you are actively striving to play very GTO, you should have some jams in this scenario. But as you start to get shallower and shallower, or as you...
It's an interesting concept, too, when I've started thinking about more and more, and it's come up quite a bit, but when I've thought about more and more what I'm doing as I'm trying to stay towards GTO at certain situations, you kind of start asking yourself the question, what are the check raises here? What are the check folds here? What are the 3-bet folds here? What are the 4-bet folds here? And at certain stack depths, all moves are available. So, you kind of have to ask those questions. And here's the fallout. When you ask the questions, what are the check raise 3-bets here, right? Like the guy checked, you bet, he raised, and now you're 3-betting. If you ask that question, you will find the answers, and that range should be balanced. So like the King Queen suited is a draw you're jamming with because you have to find draws that are in your range. There's not going to be a lot of, on this such a disconnected board, what are the real draws? Well, the real draws aren't to straights or flushes. They're really to overpairs and backdoor straights, like King Queen has, like King 10 has, like Queen 10 has, things like that. And hands like, the 5-4 suited, right? Is that on there? No, that's on a call. So what's the lowest jam draw? Looks like the King... looks like the Queen 10 suited or the Queen 9 suited for the backdoor straight and flush draws plus 1 overcard. So, and you have to look for that stuff. And when you find it, it starts expounding your knowledge and you start being able to find those scenarios for more complex things that don't come up very often. Like, you're raising under the gun, you get 3-bet by the low jack, you 4-bet, and then they 5-bet. Are there 4-bet folds in that scenario? Well, if you're, starting out 150 blinds deep, yeah, there are. But if you're starting out like 70 blinds deep, there probably aren't. But you can find them, you know what I'm saying? And maybe the 4-bet isn't even a 4-bet. Maybe it's a jam 4-bet, depending on the stack size. So it's all very important, and I think it's an important part of poker to ask these questions and see if your brain can come up with them. and you'll find that you have a lot more moves. This is why 10 big blinds 5 years ago was considered helter-skelter, just jam your chips in. It's not always so much anymore. You know what I'm saying? I mean, there's a lot of scenarios where you can raise the 10 big blinds and have raise folds. And the raise being reasonable, that if you got called, you would be able to have good equities to steal, but you don't want to race the hand and you'd rather have 8 blinds left over. A lot of these scenarios come up on the cash bubble or the final table bubble, but they also come up in mid-stakes through the tournaments where everybody's just very shallow, like in turbo situations or satellites. So I think by thinking in that manner and making sure you think in that manner, you find the answers to all of these scenarios. So it's just a good thing to keep in mind.
Use a bigger flop bet, or as you're just in a bigger pot for whatever reason to begin with, maybe a multi-way pot, etc. When you bet and get raised, when the stack to pot ratio becomes shallower and shallower, you must be getting it in with your top pair type hands that don't mind protection, and you still, though, have to call with your nut hands. Like, again, look at aces and kings, slow playing, right? Don't be afraid to slow play when you get shallow, because you don't need to build the pot anymore. You're not susceptible to being outdrawn. Do everything in your power to get your opponent to screw up, and you do that by protecting your calling range. That also lets you call a little bit wider with stuff like ace high, right? Ace high gets to stick around, king high gets to stick around, right? It's nice to be able to stick around a little bit wider because you protect your calling range in all scenarios.
Because, I mean, like, the aces after a certain point just become jokers. Like, your reads don't matter because you're just going to be seeing monsters under the bed. At 25 big blinds, if you get the money in with aces, you probably did your job. You know what I'm saying? If it's the rare scenario where somebody beat you with a hand that had 30% equity or something, mostly through the hand, fine. But you can't throw away the opportunity to get up to 50 blinds and be dominating in the tournament at that point, you know, if you're in the later stages. You're on the button versus the big blind on this 976 or 975 flop. You bet 33% get raised. Will you frequently 3-bet or infrequently? Well, I would say it's pretty infrequently, yeah. We're always referring to 40 big blinds unless specified otherwise. You're on the button versus the big blind, comes off same flop. You bet 67%, get raised. Will you 3-bet frequently or infrequently? Well, very frequently, because you're trying to reduce the stack to pot ratio. So the times when you have value hands, you're probably just going to jam the fucking money in. You know what I'm saying? Stack to pot ratio is smaller, so you should be going in more often. Because it takes less to call you. The more it takes to call you, the stronger your hand needs to be. You know what I'm saying? If you're getting in 100 blinds, you kind of have to have a monster in a tournament. But if you're getting in 25 blinds, you kind of just need a pair, you know? As the stacks get shorter, when you are check raised, should you 3-bet more often or less often? Well, I would say more often for the same reason. Stack to pot ratio is lower, so you're just willing to get the money in. All right, we're going to mark this as complete. I believe that's the last part of the check raising section of flop strategy. If that's true, it's going to take us to the next section, which nothing will be marked off on. Yeah, so we got through this whole section in about an hour. Nice. That's exactly how long I want it to go. We're going to mark it as complete. It's going to take us, I think, back to the main menu. And then we're going to take a look at the next section. Exploitative adjustments. So we start with GTO, and GTO basically gets you to a point where you can break even, and the exploitative adjustments are where you make your profit, essentially. We'll go back to the course, and I'll just show you guys where we're at this point. And this was 1 hour, okay? And you saw how much we got through because it takes a lot of time. I talk through it so I can adjust it, or so I can digest it, and so I can make sure that I understand what's happening before I move on. Come on. Come on, come on, come on. So we're now on flop strategy. You see there's turn, river, ICM, adjustments, finances, other topics, USPO, hand history review, and hand history reviews, resources, blah, 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 blah. This was just added recently. And you can see at this point, let's see. So we are through all this stuff at this point. We just finished this one. Or no. Yeah, so we just finished this one. So next it's exploitative adjustments for the flop strategies. And as you can see, if we go back to courses, this is the tournament masterclass, by the way. Come on. It's a little slow right now. I honestly don't know why. Courses. Go back to the courses. All right, well, let's jump out of this and we'll go back to courses and I'll show you. So let's see. Courses, over 1,500 of the quizzes now. I should do a stream and bang through a bunch of those. I used to just do those on stream, but I wanted to get into a deeper study on stream, so. Come on. Courses. I want to show you guys something after all this time we've put through. So it's taking a minute. Ah, shit. I might have just lost the stream. The tournament masterclass.
I'm still not sure about.
The tournament masterclass is what we're doing. It doesn't show it, but basically we're through about 20% after all that time. So I'm going to go ahead and end the stream because it looks like the stream ended on its own. Thanks a lot, you guys, for coming out for this late night study session. I'll see you in the morning, and have a great night.